Welcome everybody to the last of this fall's 21 semester seminar series for the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems here at UMBC. I'm Andy Miller, the host of the seminar series, and I am going to ask Leah Staub, one of our graduate students, to do the honors and introduce our speaker for today. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Leah.
Alrighty. So today with us we have Dr. Akira Drake Rodriguez, and she is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design. Her research examines the ways that disenfranchised groups reappropriate their marginalized spaces in the city to gain access to and sustain urban political power. She is the author of Diverging Space for Deviants, the Politics of Atlanta's Public Housing, which explores how the politics of public housing planning and race in Atlanta created a politics of resistance within its public housing developments. Dr. Rodriguez was recently awarded a Spencer Foundation grant to study how educational advocates mobilize around school facility planning processes. That's awesome. And the abstract for today's talk is as follows. In 1936, the city of Atlanta was the first U.S. city to open federally financed and locally administered public housing developments to low-income families in need of safe and sanitary housing. This was Techwood Homes. For the city's Black residents and later other marginalized groups, these developments provided political opportunity to assemble, mobilize, and make claims on the state in ways that were otherwise inaccessible. Over time, tenant associations served as conduits for working-class political interests centered in spatial justice. The very politics of planning that were used to segregate and marginalize developments and residents served as an organizing logic around spatial justice issues. However, in 2013, demolition began on one of the city's last public housing developments for low-income families, nearly 2 decades after the Techwood Homes was demolished for the 1996 Olympics. This talk today examines the historical role of public housing in working-class politics and how the loss of tenant associations in the city has deepened contemporary inequities. And with that, it's over to Dr. Rodriguez.
Thank you so much, Leah. Thank you, Andy, for this invitation and UMBC for hosting me virtually and tolerating my mask as I had to make some adjustments. So I hope you can hear me. And please let me know if you have any questions. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. As noted, this is work that started off as my dissertation when I was a PhD student at Rutgers in planning and public policy, and just writing about the role of tenant associations in structuring local politics. Essentially, my premise was looking at how the politics of planning public housing developments created a politics within these developments that people sort of articulated with spatial interventions and different grievances and shared claims to take control of their space. So I do teach in a planning department. I like to work with communities to rethink planning processes as the explicit political processes that they are. And use it as an opportunity to create political opportunity for those who are typically disenfranchised, whether it's formally through the loss of voting rights of those who have had contact with the carceral state, or whether it's just simply disenfranchised or apathetic people who have not felt that they are being legitimately represented by elected officials in local politics. And so just going to start off with this presentation. So I start off the work, again, I'm kind of covering this 75-year history of public housing in Atlanta, beginning with the creation of Techwood Homes and University Homes. Those were the first white and Black public housing developments opened in the city of Atlanta. Liberty Square in Miami actually predates the University Homes as the first Black public housing development in the United States. But University Homes has a very sort of significant legacy in being kind of like this very early sort of example of the role of anchor institutions, for example, in planning local place. And so University Homes, which was the first Black public housing development opened in 1937 in the city of Atlanta really came at a time when Black residents were not locally enfranchised. And so at the time, we had something known as the Democratic White Primary, which was established in 1892 in sort of a dual coalition between the Democratic and Populist Party to roll back the voting rights and enfranchisement that had been provided to Black Atlantans and Black Georgians in the post-emancipation years. And so as early as the 1870s, there were Black elected officials on the Board of Aldermen in the city of Atlanta, but that was quickly rolled back with the implementation of the all-white primary. During this time in the 1890s, political parties were actually private entities. And so as a private party, the Democratic Party was allowed to discriminate and have whites-only primaries. And so being a Democratic city and a Democratic state, you start to see these sort of retrol and this sort of clawing back of power, of Black power. Of course, being in the Confederacy and being a slave-owning state, there was a significant Black population in the city at the time. And so in the early 1930s, when you start to see these plans happening for public housing, although Black Atlantans are really unable to vote unless it's a special election or the general elections, they are 40% of the population and about 33% of the electorate. And so from the white business owner side, of course, there were legitimate fears of this enfranchised Black population taking control. But on the side of the sort of Black community, you start to see a whole entire host of problems, coming out of this sort of lack of political opportunity, this lack of electoral capacity. Here, we see why the sort of influx of federal dollars and federal control over local space is so important. On the left, we have a land use map of the city of Atlanta that was taken during the Works Progress Administration's survey in 1934, documenting substandard housing units. And so those dots actually represent substandard housing units. The striped areas are what are known as Negro sections. And then you have the green spaces as parks. And then these sort of red and yellow outlines are the proposed areas for public housing developments in the city. And so the idea, of course, being like many other public housing developments, that they would sort of build on existing segregation in the city. So you would not see a all Black area cleared out for white public housing and vice versa. But what research has actually showed from this time is that you do see mixed areas cleared out and prioritized, particularly for Black or white housing. And so the kind of erasure of diverse and mixed race communities is done through federal dollars and sort of upholds the sort of local biases and segregation that are happening. And so while this ability to sort of transform one's local space, just to give you some understanding, again, this is a map of the city of Atlanta. You'll notice that in these Negro areas, there are very few green spaces or parks that are here. Other sort of public spaces and institutions that are missing are high schools and libraries and auditoriums. These sorts of public spaces, as well as the arrival of modern standardized housing, start to appear as a result of the New Deal and the federal infusion of dollars that allowed what I position as essentially allows local Black leaders to sort of jump scales of the racism that was happening at the local and state levels and take advantage of the federal policies of the New Deal. With the creation of public housing, you have the creation of local advisory committees. These were predominantly mixed race committees of Black kind of elites and white elites coming together to make decisions about public housing policy for the first 8 or so public housing developments constructed between 1936 and 1940 through the New Deal and the U.S. Housing Administration. And just some of the outcomes of this local advisory committees and what this sort of means, as well as some other sort of differences between Black and white public housing. So in my dissertation, I focus exclusively on Black public housing developments that were segregated at the start. And so that includes university homes, Perry homes, and Grady homes. Next to university homes, you have John Hope homes, named after the first Black president of Morehouse College, and also the first chairman of the University Homes Advisory Committee. John Hope had been attempting to create affordable housing through limited dividend corporations as early as the 1930s in Atlanta. But because of the very small allocation of land that was provided to Black communities, specifically through the racialized zoning code in the city of Atlanta that zoned areas based on race, you see that there's little opportunity to assemble the land to make such large scale construction possible. And so this, again, is a federal opportunity that is provided at the local level where there is local control over some of that decision making around assembly. You'll also notice, again, John Hope Homes is exclusively for Black families on the left, and Clark Howell Homes is exclusively for white communities on the right. One of the first things you may notice outside of the skin color of the residents that they depict here is a small difference in these income limits. And so early public housing did not have a tenant application process, but a tenant selection process. That means that tenants were subject to income minimums and maximums, as well as really sort of intrusive home visits to make sure that the conditions of the homes they were leaving were substandard and met the qualifications of being a slum or being blighted, as well as having employment verification and interviews to make sure that they are not necessarily what they would later call a broken family. And so making sure that gender roles are intact, it's two parents, two children, all related by blood lineage. These are the sorts of things that they were looking for to make sure that they were taking the top families. And so there was a lot of what, as cream skimming happening back then. But you'll notice, again, slight differences between the Black and white income requirements that are lower for Black families than white families as a way of acknowledging, even though they are expecting 2 adults to work in these Black public housing development households versus the white assumption that there'd only be 1 working male in these households, you'll still notice that that's not enough to create equal income limits. And so even with these sort of accommodations and awareness, you had people like W.E.B. Du Bois working at Atlanta University doing surveys, sociological surveys and site analysis of the areas where these public housing developments would be constructed to get an idea about what were the conditions of families that were living that would be eligible for this public housing, and seeing that even with these sort of reduced income limits, according to the minutes of the local advisory committee at the time, these incomes would only serve the top 2% of Black Atlanta households. And so much of the clearance and slum clearance that came with the New Deal and the original political opportunity of public housing really did accrue to the upper middle class and the upper class, particularly for the Black community. So while there was opportunity in having new housing, new jobs, new play areas, this, as noted, did accrue to those at the top. Here we have an aerial view on the left of John Hope Homes and University Homes. They are located just southwest of downtown in Atlanta by what is known as the Atlanta University Center Consortium, Center, sorry. The AUC is the house of Atlanta University, Morris Brown, Spelman, Morehouse, other long-term HBCUs in the city, and that was very much intentional under John Hope. The idea was that there would be this robust partnership that we're used to seeing from anchor institutions, that professors would come into university homes and teach classes, that there would be opportunities for social work students to provide services to the community as well. Beginning at Atlanta School of Social Work, you have one of the first Black public housing manager programs and trainings that are happening at this HBCU that is training public housing managers all across the country to work in these segregated developments. So again, they are providing housing. The local advisory committee really did advocate to have Black laborers and construction workers doing this work. Obviously, the housing staff at the time were also all Black. And so this was a jobs creator. This was creating housing. This was creating political opportunity. A lot of the common areas and commercial opportunities constructed there, barbershops, beauty salons, grocers, pharmacies, nurseries, healthcare clinics, all of these things found a place, a literal place in public housing developments. Again, an opportunity that was not going to be afforded in a city or state where the white Democratic primary was in existence. However, the role of race continues to structure housing opportunity and housing development and planning in the city of Atlanta. And so although racial zoning is formally outlawed in 1917, it's declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the court case Buchanan v. Worley. The tracking of races and the decision-making around planning, particularly around race, continues as evidenced by these land use maps of the 1940s and 50s from the city of Atlanta, where there is careful documentation of not only where the Black population is living, but where they're going and where their numbers are increasing. And so Atlanta, of course, is one of the first stops on the Great Migration. And so although there was always kind of a large Black population because it was a slaveholding state, the Black proportion in population only continued to increase throughout the 40s and 50s. Just thinking more about some of those early political opportunities that emerged, public housing was not the housing of last resort, was not, the second ghetto when it first originated in the 30s and 40s in Atlanta, and instead was a source of pride for local Black elites in particular. And so we have here a demonstration with Mayor William B. Hartsfield. This is around 1949, 1950. And I've done some research as well, looking at sort of mobility patterns of these early public housing residents. I managed to find in the archives a survey that listed for all 600 units in university homes, the rents paid, the number of people who lived in those individual units, and then the reasons that they actually left that unit. And between 1936 or 1937 when it opened and around roughly 1953, you see up to 25% of people leaving public housing for private home ownership. And so there is not this idea, and again, that comes from some of the earlier evidence that I showed looking at those brochures that talked about how many of these households were actually quite stabilized as middle class. And it was the ability to pay a cheap rent for a good quality home that's proximate to good neighborhood amenities that people are able to save. And then a few other things happening at the local scale that create robust private housing opportunities. And so if the goal of public housing is to act as sort of this stepping stone or way station as it was posited for white families and not a place of last resort as it's currently framed now, these early interventions suggested that did work. There is also a great deal of political opportunity in Washington, D.C. This upper left-hand corner photo showing what was known as the Black Kitchen Cabinet for FDR, Mary McLeod Bethune here in the center, Robert C. Weaver, who goes on to be the first secretary for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Also here, all working to make sure there are equitable opportunities for Black workers, residents, housing managers, architects, and engineers in all of these public housing programs. At the local level, The white primary officially ends in 1946 with a court case known as King v. Chalmers. And so the white primary is abolished in the state of Georgia, and almost immediately you start to see a more enfranchised and emboldened Black electorate. One of the first things that they wanted, particularly Black elites, but you could say that this is quite common throughout the different class formations in the Black community, was the need for Black police officers. And so William Hartsfield in 1948 appoints these first 8 officers, the first Black officers in the South. But much like other sort of concessions that Black leaders are able to make in this time of what Clarence Stone calls the urban regime, the biracial urban regime, you start to see what these concessions actually mean. And so while these 8 officers would walk around with Mayor Hartsfield and do a lot of public events, they were unable to arrest white people, and they were segregated into their own police precinct that was in the basement of the all-Black YMCA. With the end of the white primary meant that there was, again, as noted, Black people were about 40% of the total population in Atlanta and about 33% of the electorate. And so the idea that Black people could go from having like 0 power to a significant amount of power in the city was very sort of alarming based on the internal memos of William B. Hartsfield, the mayor at the time. And so I have here some maps showing the kind of proportion and spatial distribution of Black residents in the city of Atlanta using the decennial census, and so 1940s on the left, 1950 on the right. Again, most Black Americans living in sort of these 5 neighborhoods, roughly since the 1880s, extensive Black settlement occurring there. As a result of the end of the white primary in 1946, Hartsfield proposes a change known as the 1951 Plan of Improvement, which increased the square miles of Atlanta by about 74 square miles, so went from about 37 square miles to about 110, and annexed about 100,000 residents, predominantly white, in the northern suburbs. So if anyone has been following what's been happening in Atlanta recently outside of electing a new mayor, they have also, there's been a big push to have another secession by these same northern suburbs because of increasing crime rates or any other number of reasons. And so this sort of concession dampens the impact of the Black vote and also creates this opportunity. And so much of the expansion of the city came in the Northwest. And so the Northwest was intentionally annexed. It was very underdeveloped land, largely rural, not a lot of infrastructure there, but largely was seen as an opportunity to provide increased private and public housing opportunities for the Black community. And you can see how it quickly became a Northwestern ghetto virtually in a decade. And so this sort of deep concentration has actually shifted with the end of public housing and the demolition of public housing, largely again in that Northwest corridor, and you start to see the same sort of concentration shift from the Northwest down to the Southwest and Southeast. With the expansion of the Northwest and the concentration of poverty and race in that quadrant, you start to see a very different type of tenant association. And so the earlier sort of iteration of the public housing tenant, as I mentioned, was one of tenant selection, was one of cream skimming, helping the top 2% of the Black Atlanta population. With the shifts in public housing's federal policy, particularly with changes in urban redevelopment, urban renewal that came in the 1949 and 54 housing acts, now public housing authorities have to prioritize the rehousing of those who are displaced by urban renewal projects. And so when you are going to clear a slum, for example, or declare an area blighted, instead of just saying good luck to the people who live there, you have to prioritize their rehousing in public housing developments. And so very quickly, public housing's literal residential population changes a great deal. You start to see more women-headed households, more single mothers, which were not allowed in earlier public housing tenant selection requirements. And you start to see a more antagonistic tenant association. And so before, in some of those pictures I showed, the residents giving an award to the housing manager, and there's a lot of cooperation and collaboration, because these are essentially the same sorts of people, right? These are the top 2% of Black Atlantans and the Black professional class that is being trained to be a Black housing manager, et cetera, at the local university. So there was much more collegiality and cooperation. By the time of the 1960s and early 70s, federal priorities are shifting away from public housing and public housing maintenance. And you start to see a more austere policy come down and a more sort of like militant and sort of combative tenant association emerge. And so on the left, you have a rent strike held at Capitol Homes. So you also have desegregation happening. I showed one of the pamphlets earlier was, oh no, it's from Clark Howell Homes, but these are also like kind of formerly white public housing developments changing into all Black public housing developments, again, virtually overnight. And also organizations outside of the Tenant Association. And so here on the right, a protest from Tenants United for Fairness, or TUF, protesting the role of pests and lack of maintenance that came particularly in the areas in the Northwest that were underdeveloped. And so there was, as noted, no infrastructure available, no sidewalks, no street lights, no traffic lights, no high schools, no elementary schools. A lot of the land had also been industrial, and so the creek that ran alongside Perry Homes constantly overflowing with sewage because that infrastructure was not adequate for the number of people who were living in those communities. And so there was a constant need to fight just to have the sort of clean and sanitary and safe homes that were promised in the Housing Act. You also see the sort of making these wider claims outside of the housing authority. So instead of just protesting the role of the housing authority in their communities, they're also getting more engaged to shape and reshape city powers around their needs. So on the left, we have Mary Sanford, who was president of one of those Northwest developments, Perry Homes. Mary Sanford was president there for about 25 years. Here she is testifying at a MARTA meeting, which is the Metropolitan Atlanta Regional Transit Authority, their local public transit, to get some changes in public transportation in the Northwest, where most of these women were living, most of the Black population was living. They were still working as domestic workers in all white suburbs in the North. And so they would take several buses down to the very end of the subway line, take that all the way east into the city, and then take it north. And so they were advocating for what is known as a spur line to sort of help connect them based on their, and help the city and regional planners start to think about their needs and priorities when designing and planning for the city. Here on the right, we have Ethel May Matthews, who was not a public housing resident, but organized in the spaces of public housing development, taking on again a lot of the claims of the National Welfare Rights Organization that is putting the issue of hunger and poverty that was prevalent in these Black communities at the feet of the legislature. These political organizing and claims came again in the wake of austerity, and they came with very high costs. So this is something that I found in the archives from around, it's undated, but roughly around 1978, when a public relations consultant is hired, and through her conversations with the housing authority's management, came up with these sort of list of priorities. And number 8 on that list is this idea of evicting undesirables. And so again, the sort of impacts of going from tenant selection to tenant application, the housing authority felt like they had no control over who was coming into their housing developments. And so instead of taking, again, this very sort of structural approach that we have these old aging buildings that are about 40 years old, we have virtually no subsidies coming in from the federal government, we have reduced rent revenues coming in. Their decision is to sort of cut off those decreasing rent revenues by cutting out their least paying or least desirable tenants. The Brooke Amendment in 1969 creates a cap on public housing rents that is 25% of the tenant's income. And as a result, you see a sharp decrease in rents there as well. And so the actual ability for the public housing authority to sustain itself soon starts to hinge on these sort of quality tenants that they're fighting over. And you can see a lot of this coming up in current, whether it's project-based Section 8 or other sort of subsidized housing models, this sort of shift towards targeting behaviors and targeting tenant qualities as a way of sort of maximizing revenue and keeping subsidized housing afloat. At the national level, you also start to see this shift. And so many of you are probably familiar with the welfare queen narrative that emerges in the 1980s. This is also when public housing is being sort of demonized as human file cabinets set to explode. And the idea of sort of getting rid of public housing becomes something that is eventually going to become common sense. And so instead of redeveloping or transforming or downscaling or right sizing, just the idea that demolition is very much progress and that the sort of evils of public housing could be eliminated through demolition. At the local level, you also have a series of disappearances and homicides that are later characterized as the Atlanta child murders happening between 1979 and 1982. The ages of these victims range from about 13 to 24. And as noted, came at a time where I would say about a third of these victims were found in or near public housing developments that had been abandoned or were lying vacant. And so the lack of policing, the lack of care, the lack of economic opportunity is very much another sort of raison d'etre to demonize the mothers in particular of public housing residents. And again, you start to see this discussion about what should we do about public housing? What should we do about this population? And so you start to see some repeating of earlier conversations, particularly around blight and slums that were being held in the 1930s and in the 1950s with urban renewal. You start to see those conversations happening again in the early 1980s. Policing comes first by request from people. And so, you know, during the 1970s, when a lot of cities were sort of triaging public services, you don't see as much police presence or attention paid to public safety. And so you start to see some community policing happening as requested by tenant leadership in the early or late 1980s. And by the 1990s, this becomes a much more top-down relationship, where the Atlanta Police Department and the Atlanta Housing Authority are cooperating to allow police officers to live in vacant units, to allow vacant units and spaces to convert to mini precincts. Later, you see in the archives an accusation from the chief of police that the Housing Authority Executive Director is paying bonuses to police officers to go into units and arrest people that they know have warrants out on them. Any sort of arrest or conviction could result in a loss of public housing privileges with the implementation of Clinton's one strike rule. And so you start to, again, what starts off as a cooperative and collaborative relationship between tenants and another institution becomes much more antagonistic over the course of time. You also start to see local think tanks and planners start to think about what to do with the land of public housing. And so here is something from an organization known as the Research Atlanta, looking at those first kind of 6 to 8 public housing developments that were constructed during the New Deal between 1936 and 1940, and thinking about some possible land uses, again, as early as 1980 to do. So the expansion of the downtown connector, which is the local interstate, I-75, I-85, expansion of the local convention center, of office space, of the MARTA rail line. Again, this idea that this clearance and a conversion to more economically viable land uses could be a better use of this particular land. And so you start to see the sort of diminishing political opportunity being afforded to tenants over time. Even tenant leaders became fairly conservative and wanting to get rid of these undesirables. And so here, a quote by Rebecca English, who was the head of one of these Tenant Association councils, talking about it is time for us to start making some examples through evictions. And if we do, we are going to clean up public housing. And so a lot of early experiments in the 1990s, known as resident management corporations, allowed for tenant associations to incorporate and start taking on control of public housing developments. But what they actually took control of was actually just all of the burdens of public housing. And so these tenant associations were charged, sure, with hiring people to do groundskeeping and small jobs like that, but largely were in charge of evicting and enforcing evictions and grievances during the kind of last decade or so that public housing was in existence in Atlanta. The arrival of the Olympics in 1990 create an opportunity to actually put that plan from the 1980s into play. Sort of like the same neighborhoods are being targeted for redevelopment, for new Olympic villages and stadium development. And this, again, protested by public housing residents. This is also Ethel May Matthews from before. She kind of fought her whole life for public housing. Attempting again to demonstrate the vitality and usefulness and the potential fears of permanent displacement. And so there were ideas to convert public housing developments into temporary Olympic villages and then sort of give those new buildings back to the residents. But there was severe fear that ended up being justified that there would be no return for many residents. Hope 6 puts the financial and policy backing around this Olympic displacement idea of providing housing authorities, particularly those on the severely troubled list, to create leverage opportunities with private developers that would allow them to use public funds to demolish and redevelop mixed use, mixed income housing that would later go under largely private management. And this is sort of where the story ends. I saw this article in the New York Times while I was writing, while I was a PhD student, and this sort of rebirth of Atlantis housing and the loss of political opportunity is sort of done throughout the 20th century. Between 1993 and 2016, Atlanta demolished approximately 8,000 units of public housing. In the 1980s, about 10% of Atlanta's population lived in public housing, and now such a small amount, it's largely just elderly residents and those who have housing choice vouchers or project-based Section 8 as well. And as a result of this sort of loss of this critical housing stuff, you start to see all of these sort of ripple effects, whether it's foreclosures or evictions. you start to see these patterns emerge again, predominantly on the Black and low income population in Atlanta, with very little sort of recourse. And so while there are housing justice and tenant associations that have sort of taken the place of those, there is no sort of permanent place in the city for tenant associations and for the care work that came with the tenant associations. And so it's not just the ability to keep someone in their homes or keep someone from being evicted, but having this actual space to articulate the needs of the people beyond housing and the use of the housing development as something that's not just shelter, but something that's much, much more and able to advocate for working class politics in a very sort of structural and non-individualist way. So with that, I will end there. I'll take questions if there are any. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much. We're going to open it up for people who have questions. At this point, since there's nothing in the chat that anybody's posted, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself. And if you want, if we get several lined up, I see that Matt Fagan's raising his hand, so
Sure.
I'll call on him first. But then others, you can type your question in the chat. We'll ask you to unmute and ask your question in turn in which they show up. So, Matt, take it away.
Matt was applauding.
Oh, okay.
I don't have a question. I just really
No, it's
enjoyed
fine. I
learning.
appreciate it. I'll take the applause. There's no worries.
So one of the things I'm really fascinated by in urban areas is the tension between expansion and not. And you mentioned there's a current succession movement going on, and kind of tension about local control. And I think of Houston as an analogy. You know, it's I think the third largest city in the country now, and it did that. It absorbed all its suburbs. And I'm wondering, do you see parallels among these kind of large cities that have done that versus cities that are very small and have a core, like Detroit, which is, you know, tiny and has a kind of very different political control for the suburbs?
Oh yeah, it's definitely like kind of related to. It's usually two things, and I always think everything's about race, but like this annexation that happened in Atlanta was definitely about race. Like there's documents that show like we don't want like a Black mayor in Atlanta because they will have so much control. And I think a place like Houston, where you have like a pretty fluid migrant population, that those fears are similar, right? That people want to expand. Yes, to take advantage of the tax base, but also to make sure that an affluent tax base is guiding local politics. And so I definitely think, and that is very much what's happening with the Buckhead succession right now, is that they're like, well, we're tired of paying Atlanta's taxes. We're tired of not having white mayors and white representation. We want to like keep our money and keep our tax base in this little section and let them deal with it. So I was just like reading a manuscript that hopefully will be out on Oxford University Press soon about a similar situation in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. East Baton Rouge's desire to sort of secede and create their own city. First, they tried to do it through the school district, and now they actually, you know, just tried to go ahead and create their own city, very much because of the racial transformation and economic transformation of the main city.
Thanks. Does anybody else have a question? Here we come. Here's one from Leah. Leah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if in present day, if there were any differences in the housing applications for public housing based on their location, specifically in predominantly Black neighborhoods versus predominantly white neighborhoods. I was just curious if there were any differences between those applications, if you knew of any.
Yeah, no. So there's really no ability to get public housing at this point. Like if you're in a major city, like in Philly, for example, our public housing waiting list is 10 years. In New York, it's like 20. But if you want to be on Staten Island, it's like 2. So it does, like, in that sense that we are in very sort of segregated cities. And depending on where you're looking, so usually white areas, suburbs, for example, if there happens to be public housing there, they don't have anything else. So they don't have public transit, they don't have local goods and services that are public and affordable. They're not near areas that are near kind of like the family networks of the people who are applying. And so the desire to go to them are not great. And so we've seen this a lot with like our shift to mobility programs in the 1970s. Many of you may have heard of like GETRO or Move to Opportunity, or even how we use Section 8 vouchers or housing choice vouchers now. They're not very successful in creating like these integrated havens, right? And other means, whether it's LIHTC of like citing public housing or low income housing in economically diverse areas. Those are not really viable options. Either there's NIMBYism, like not in my backyard, that's sort of blocking the full capacity for that to happen, or there's just like good old fashioned racism, right? And so if you have a housing choice voucher, for example, that's issued, and supported by federal policy and a local housing authority, in addition to not being, enough to match the rents that you actually need. So the stipend or the subsidy is not high enough. You also have a lot of local, particularly suburban localities that don't have source of income discrimination laws on the books. And so people are legally allowed to discriminate if you have a housing choice voucher. And so that is something that makes it so the actual applications are not different per se, but the outcomes still kind of perpetuate the racial segregation that we've seen in the past.
Gotcha. Thank you. That was, yeah.
So Joe Gallagher has a question. Joe?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez. This was a really awesome presentation. I kind of had like a methodological question, which was if the genesis of this project was in like a smaller historical moment, such as like the Olympics arrival, or if you always kind of had this historical frame in mind and you always wanted to cover kind of the whole of public housing in Atlanta, or if you realized at some point that you kind of had to zoom out and tell that whole story.
Yeah, so much of like my research was just like good luck and opportunity. So I originally just wanted to look at mixed income communities. But I just found like a lot of the things that I saw in mixed income communities, particularly like Hope 6, was that there was so much discrimination against public housing residents. Like you talk about two different processes, like the application processes to get back into like a Hope 6 development, if you're like a market rate homeowner or renter versus subsidized, is like night and day. You usually don't have tenant associations, for example, for subsidized residents in these Hope 6 redevelopments versus homeowner associations are like completely okay. Public housing residents who lived in these communities couldn't grill in their backyards, couldn't hang laundry on their balconies. They later couldn't in Chicago, like Mark Joseph and Robert Chaskin talk about how they couldn't even grill in the community park because the homeowners didn't like having smoke in their way. And so this was like the kind of politics of that is what actually led me to my question. And then I literally saw that Atlanta article, and they noted that Atlanta was the first city to have public housing, the first city to kind of tear most of it down. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then as a result of tearing that public housing down, including some historically preserved buildings of Techwood homes, the first development in the country, they had to create an archive. And so like it was like me, like Larry Vail and Ed Getz, who also do major public housing research, were like the first three people to get into these archives because they were developing it as we were doing our research. So it was just a great opportunity. So my actual dissertation just went up to 74, which is like the federal moratorium on public housing construction. But for the book, I just took it to the present. But I didn't intend to have this historical scope, but I just love history. And it was like a really sort of interesting narrative.
Thanks. We have a question from Dawn Bealer. Dawn?
Hi, thanks so much, Dr. Rodriguez. This is a full talk. I'm sorry that I missed a little bit of the beginning of it. So if my question sounds like I missed the opening, that's why. So I know you're talking to us about a historical focused project, and it can be annoying to be asked to read the tea leaves of the future based on that. But I guess looking at that kind of long historical, decades long scope, I'm wondering what, if you have any thoughts on the future of tenant power and the possibility for organizing around affordable housing and public subsidies on housing. In part, given that, like, it seems like a lot of initiatives for affordable housing, as you say, are kind of like breaking up communities and dispersing them so that people don't even know each other and they don't form like geographical, local, or neighborhood based networks, and are instead they're kind of dispersed around the community. And I say this coming from the point of view of I live in Washington, D.C., and I've been trying to get involved with some local community organizing around affordable housing and tenant power. And it's really challenging. And prior to going to grad school, I helped with organizing to resist Hope 6. And other of Clinton's housing policies back around 1999, 2000, before I started grad school. So I'm like seeing the difference in these time periods is really interesting. And I'm wondering, having looked at this whole trajectory, what you think.
Yeah, it is really interesting, of course, to be, I continue to kind of work with tenant organizers nationally and still within Atlanta. And it's really hard, right? And so like, one, it's really hard to get people to organize if there's not a crisis. So unless you're getting evicted, you're probably not going to just like join a tenant association. So that's the step one, is that like it's only in crisis that you see these surges in membership or awareness. And also there's no, in public housing, at least in Atlanta, and this is very sort of case by case basis, you had to have a tenant association and you had to give them space to meet and you had to give them a budget. And so there are so many things that were sort of cut off with the new iterations of subsidized housing policy, whether it is housing choice vouchers or Hope 6 or whatever, that they just sort of took those things out. Like, as developers say, you don't need a tenant association because there's no problems in the building. And so when you think about tenant associations as only being needed when there are like maintenance or facilities problems, you start to lose a lot of like the purpose of them. One place in Atlanta, so I've been working with a group called the Housing Justice League, but one place where I'm starting to see kind of like similar possibilities for organizing that is not in housing specific is they have regional PTA clusters. So a lot of the work I do now is with schools. And the reason I work with schools now is because like that's what drives so much housing decision making, right? Like, moving here for the good schools, I'm leaving because the schools are bad, etc. And so a lot of, because schools are usually geographically based with a school catchment area, a lot of the shared structural problems, whether it's poverty, economic opportunity, public transit, parks, etc., can be articulated in a school catchment, right? And so a lot of parents who had been displaced from public housing, who had lost their housing choice voucher, were meeting and congregating and getting like legal aid services and other services in the PTA meetings. And so that was just sort of a different, like, it's a consistent point of contact. You know, people are there every day to drop their kids off. And so it's just like another really interesting space to think about it in. On the flip side, as someone studying schools now, I know that parent participation drops off after like 6th grade, right? Like, you don't go to your PTA for your kids in high school, right? You're like, you go to those meetings. So like, it's not as equitable as like a tenant association, but even tenant associations, when I like brought up the idea in this sort of like national tenant organizing meeting of like pushing HUD to fund tenant organizations for those with vouchers and other kind of subsidized housing, just making it a requirement across all housing programs. A lot of people, current organizers, voiced a good critique that like those tenant leaders got co-opted every day. And they were usually working for the housing authority and like in cahoots with the managers and voting to demolish public housing. And so they're like not so comfortable with asking HUD to finance that. And so it is very difficult because it's always been volunteer labor, volunteer tenant organizers, volunteer legal aid, just like a lot, just so people can have like adequate rights and access to like good quality housing. And so it requires such a like structural shift into thinking about like how we think about housing and our relationship to it so that we can make sure that we have like a robust tenant sort of politics. And it's like, well, would we need them if everyone had adequate housing? So it's like one of those things where it's like, let's just fight for the housing and then we'll worry about the organizing. But I'm of the mind that the organizing should be ongoing and consistent. But that's not something that's always supported in current sort of tenant politics.
Really interesting. I'm going to turn to Charlie Kaler, who has a question.
Sure.
Yeah, I actually, this is the second talk on housing in Atlanta that I've witnessed today.
What? That's funny.
This one was far better, by the way. No, I'm on the drive-in this morning. I listened to 99% Invisible, the podcast, and it was about Collier Heights.
Oh.
And I recommend it. It was a really interesting look at what was, for, if you've never heard of Collier Heights, it was unincorporated, now part of Atlanta prior to its being obtained by the city through annexation. It was some sort of local cooperative effort on the part of urban African American elites who started buying up land, kind of subalternly. They had to do it in secret for a variety of reasons that are kind of sketched out in the podcast. And what it got me thinking about in the context of your presentation is just the role of cross-cutting cleavages, not just race. We tend to view things through the lens of things like redlining, but also that urban African American elites in the South play an interesting role, and the dynamics become very complicated, particularly around issues that involve land.
Yes. So I didn't really talk much about local politics in that sense, but the shift from kind of like the white urban regime to the black urban regime that begins in 1974 with the election of Maynard Jackson, the first black mayor of Atlanta. And there's been a black mayor in Atlanta since 74 and a majority black council since the 80s. But during this particular time of public housing demolition and displacement, there was like virtually all black women leadership. And so there was like a black woman mayor, Shirley Franklin. The head of the Atlanta Housing Authority for 20 years was Renee Glover, a black woman. The chief of police that I said like sent that note about paying bonuses to arrest residents. She was the first black woman chief of police, Beverly Harvard, and even the first black woman superintendent, who you all may know from the Atlanta Public Schools cheating scandal, Beverly Hall, was also sort of involved in like creating these really sort of intricate land deals that were essentially going to disenfranchise and displace predominantly black women. And so if you know anything about the work around like black women politicians or respectability politics, this is a really sort of important tension. We are only going to have one black woman representative, right? And like if we talk to the black head of the housing authority, that's the same as talking to your most disenfranchised black women tenant, right? And work that I've done with Michael Owens at Emory and Rob Brown at Spelman, we show that cities that have long-standing black leadership, either with mayors or city council, or even the heads of the executive of the housing authority, they are more likely to engage in demolition politics and have higher rates of removal. And we got a lot of pushback from reviewers that were like, this doesn't even make sense. Like, why would they demolish their biggest like voting block, right? Like, how could they do that? And it's like, well, I think anti-blackness like trumps this idea of like black solidarity. Like, these black leaders are operating with very like low revenues, very little outside investment, very high tax-based needs, and they want to get rid of public housing. And like with Hope 6, there was federal money to do it. And so like that was just the, Adolph Reed talks about like black leadership and neoliberal politics as being like fraternal twins. They came up at the same time. And so like certainly like the class aspect is huge. And the gender aspect is also huge. This idea that black women were going against black women was like, it only happened. And I see it now with the school stuff. Whenever there's like a nasty thing to happen with Philly schools, like they're going through a planning process now that'll result in, for sure, school closures in black neighborhoods. They hired a black woman consultant to run that process. And I think these are like intentional things to defer or divert criticism or claims of racism or sexism or whatever, is by having these kind of like representatives. Like these, like Renee Glover, who ran the housing authority, she went to Yale. Like I've met her. She's like not an evil person or anything like that, but she's no like black loyalist. So like, it's just like very, it's something that like I talked about. I think like Maurice Hobson talks about it. He has a book called Race and Class and the Black Mecca. Danielle Wiggins, a political scientist at Emory, I think is also, or Vanderbilt, I think is also writing about Maynard Jackson. And so like I think soon we'll see a lot more criticism about, and you all like in Baltimore, like this, right? Like this happens all the time of pitting these groups against each other, and like no claims of racism, even though if there was like a white guy making the decisions, it would be a whole different story. And so it's interesting.
This is really fascinating. We are now past 1 o'clock, and so I think we're getting close to having to finish this up. I'll just mention Dawn just put in the chat that Derek Musgrove talks about this in DC, and he was actually, I didn't notice, but he was actually listening until a couple of minutes ago.
Oh.
So
Cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I just have one question, because one of the things that intrigued me when you started talking was the way that this started out, which was that there was more prestige associated with this public housing, and it was somewhat exclusive, and it actually fostered economic development, and then it gradually devolved as there was disinvestment. Is that trajectory something that you see in any other city, or is that unique to Atlanta? I mean, it's really fascinating to me that the story that you were telling there.
Oh no, I think certainly, particularly if they
I mean, the latter part is common, but I'm talking about the first part too.
Yeah, the early part I think would also be equally common, because being a federal program, everyone kind of had these pretty high standards, right? And so most, I read a lot of the meeting minutes for those early, like for university homes, like specifically their tenant selection policy. And there were women on that board who said, what about teachers? They're not allowed to be married, and like they should be able to live here as single women. And like the men being like, ugh, that's gonna cause like bad family structure, and who's gonna like, so like there were like, and so I think those conversations and ideologies were quite common. That you had to be a two-parent household, you had to have employment verification, you had to, so there was just so much coming out of the Great Depression that people were required to have, that it was really just intended for these sort of submerged middle class, as opposed to kind of acting for a true stepping stone. And then once that federal policy shifted with the with urban renewal policy, you start to see like the common downwards trajectory happening, because it was coupled with like that immediate disinvestment from the federal government. And so it was a combination of old buildings and lack of rent revenues and federal support that creates these common stories across place.
Well, we could go, I could listen to this all day, but unfortunately we do have to bring it to a close. So I just really want to thank you for a fascinating discussion. And there's so many connections to Baltimore also. We could go on about that for 2 hours, but
I agree.
really
I
appreciate
love
it.
Baltimore. I know it's all right there. It's yeah.
Everything you can think of has, well, we're not going to go there because we don't have time, but thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you all for the invite. Really appreciate it. Hope you all have a great and relaxing break. Thank you.
And you too. I understand today's your last day from what you told us before. So congratulations on the end of the semester to everybody. I'm going to
Yeah,
stop
for
the
sure.
recording now, and then we'll end the meeting in just a moment.
Okay.